loves, I am back today to talk to you about my best reads of 2022. I realised that entitling these videos and blog posts best books of 2022, it kind of sounds like I'm talking about books that were released in 2022. So it's really my best reads, but I don't know what I'm going to title this video, but all the great books I read in 2022. I read 62 books in total, and I had a whopping 24 favourites, which is very good going for me. So I had a really good reading year. I have lots to talk to you about, so I am going to dive in before I start rambling on. But one thing I have to mention, I know this is coming to you sort of mid-January. The reason for that is I just can't do the thing where people round up their books of the year in December. I'm always like, but what about the book you read all through December and you finished on the 30th of December or 31st of December? Like, do those not count? Where do they go? So I always have to wait till the 1st of January to even start thinking about this, and then, as with all things January, it takes me a little while to get around to it. So we're finally here. Let's get into the books. Let's start with the best of the best. Sorry, I just had to find a book, and the reason I had to find it was because the baby unstacked one of my stacks the other day in a safe, supervised manner, but she took them off the stack one by one. I put them back, and I had lost this book, but I've now found it. So this is my best of the best pile. Pretty good going, I think. So I'm going to whip through these, otherwise we will be here forever, and Zach's supposed to be editing this video and he's going to hate me if I keep rambling on. So first up, Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson. This was just such a beautiful novella, gorgeously written. Johnson's prose is so good. There is another Johnson in here. It's the story of a labourer called Robert Grenier living in the American West during the early part of the 20th century. So it's a big time of transformation in that part of the world, for better or worse. And Robert Grenier just finds himself sort of between nature and society. He's quite a kind of contained man, and we sort of find out why over the course of the book, which is set out in a non-linear fashion, so we get kind of scenes from various different points in his life. It's very masterfully done, the way Johnson puts certain scenes up against each other and the way he reveals what's happened in Grenier's life. And it just sort of shows like what makes up a life, you know, and what are the defining moments of a life, even though they might not feel defining at the time, and you know, all the shameful things you do and the heroic things you do and how they can sit alongside one another. And it's all in this just tiny little page count in the most beautiful language. So I highly recommend this one, especially if you liked In the Distance by Hernan Diaz. This one you must read. Next up, A Passage North by Anouk Arupragasam. This was shortlisted for the 2021 Booker Prize. So I went in with very little expectations because I am a bit jaded from my time reading Booker Prize longlists and shortlists, but this was truly excellent. Such a gorgeous novel, and not usually my kind of style, not my like absolute favourite style, so the fact it's made it into this category is a testament to how good it is. It's about Krishan. His grandmother's carer has died in a village in the north of Sri Lanka. He basically has to go and attend the funeral. So that's basically it on the plot line. It is a very simple plot, but as he processes this news and then goes to the village where Rani is from, he just does a lot of reflection. He's thinking about his life, he's thinking about his relationship to the Sri Lankan Civil War, which was, he was a student abroad at the time, so observing it from afar, from quite a privileged position. It's also just exploring more generally kind of love, life, aging, family and the ties that bond us, all these things. So it's a very reflective novel. Not a lot happens in it, but just the language is so beautiful. He has these kind of run-on sentences, but they're very readable for that kind of style and just really elegantly put, and I just found it a joy to read. It's a very warm novel. It obviously calls to mind comparisons to Proust for that kind of internal world, like breaking down the tiny moments of your internal life, and then also the style with the kind of long sentences. but it is a much warmer, readable version. It taught me a lot about Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan Civil War. It also kind of called to mind because I read the Batuman books, which I will talk about in a minute as well, where she also talks a lot about the art and the documentaries and stuff that are part of her life at the time. And yeah, I think both are really well done, and this one I really enjoyed. Next up, Stoner by John Williams. This was almost universally beloved by our whole book club. We got a lot of discerning readers in there, so it really is that good, as long as you like kind of quietly told books. But I think they're some of the best. It's a beautiful book about a professor of English living and working at the University of Missouri. It's just about a quiet, kind of unassuming life that, you know, is not very well remembered after Stoner passes away, and it feels like he's left very little impact on the world. But in this book, Williams shows us the beauty of just all life. You don't need to have a legacy to have a worthy life and something worth writing about. It is such a beautiful book. It is extremely sad, you know. There are parts of Stoner's life which are extremely sad, but I found it to be overall quite uplifting. It's just beautifully written as well, and I loved it. Many of us loved it, so we highly recommend this one. Next up, The Road. I do have a category in here which is rereads, and this is a reread, but I read it such a long time ago. I want to say I was like 16 or something, and I barely remember it, so it felt pretty fresh to me, and I thought it deserved a place in this category anyway. This book is not going to appeal to everyone, and it definitely had a sort of mixed, because we did a buddy read for it, it definitely had a sort of mixed reaction, but I really liked it. It's this tale about a man and a boy surviving apocalyptic America. Everything is covered in grey dust, everything is grey, nothing is growing. They basically have to survive on cans of old food and try and hide from a bunch of cannibals and, you know, other horrendous vestiges of humanity. So it's pretty depressing. It's a lot of grey and it's very stripped back, but I loved it. I saw so much beauty in it. I loved the relationship between the man and the boy. It's very subtly done, mostly through small moments and through dialogue. I loved some of the themes, the kind of faith, the faith that we can put in other people that we love. I just thought it was really beautiful. I don't know, I really did enjoy this one, and it's reminded me that I need to read more McCarthy. This is the only one I've ever read. I have got one of his trilogies, what's it called? The Border trilogy, on my shelves, so I would like to read that this year. Next up, another book that kind of touched me, and is also about a parent-child relationship. I could not stop reading this book. I read it in like 24 hours or something ridiculous, which is particularly odd considering how kind of literary this novel is. It's very clever, it's very layered, it's very complex. I think a lot of it went over my head because I just couldn't stop reading it. I don't know, it was right book, right time, obviously. It is about a paleobiologist / geologist who discovers that his daughter has a degenerative disease, which is just heartbreaking, obviously. And then at the same time, he finds this note. He buys a jacket off eBay and he finds a note in it saying, "Help me," in Spanish. And he can't stop thinking about it, and he kind of feels like he has to solve that mystery. So these two things run in parallel. This book actually has 3 different endings and 3 different versions. I would like to pick up the other versions at some point. Yeah, I need to reread it at some point because I just read it so quickly. It is often quite meandering, it's quite absurd at times, but it deals with grief in this really interesting, unique way, and parenthood. It just felt very sensitive and very beautiful. So I really enjoyed this one. Next up, Venomous Lumpsucker by Ned Bowman. I talked about this one a lot as well. So this is a book about mass extinction. It's set in the near future, and this extinction industry has popped up where companies can buy credits to destroy the last habitats of animals, and if that animal or species or organism is deemed intelligent, then they have to buy more credits and it's more expensive. So obviously this just ends up being a free-for-all on the last precious habitats of many organisms, like any kind of late capitalist take on climate change. Bowman does a really, really amazing job of just taking it down incisively. It's a really clever book. There's lots of kind of factual stuff in here. It's nerdy and fun. Yeah, it's funny. So it's a funny book about mass extinction, I know. Is that possible? It is possible. And basically we're following two people. We're following someone that works for one of these conglomerates that buys credits, and then a biologist who also kind of works for them, and goes around seeing if species are intelligent, but she's not an animal lover. So neither of them are particularly lovable characters, which work so well, and they just go around, they don't like each other, and they're trying to find the last venomous lumpsucker individuals, hence the title, because chaos has struck. I don't want to go into the whole plot line for you, but I really, really recommend this one. It just took me by surprise, and I really enjoyed it, and I think I want to read more of Bowman's work. Final book in this category is The Weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. I read a lot of this in 2021, took it into 2022 with me, and finally finished it this time last year, and I adored it. Really, really loved this. I didn't really like any of the stories, as I've said before, until about 1970. That tracks with generally how I feel about literature, particularly in this genre. They're kind of important to read through, and I really did kind of appreciate that I had read all the earlier stories by the time I got to the later ones. But yeah, I didn't really enjoy or want to look up the authors that much until we got from 1970 onward. But this was such a rewarding experience. It gave me a really good knowledge and feel of the huge scope of the weird genre, which I love and is one of my favourites. There were so many fantastic stories in here, obviously some which were more kind of duds, some which were just good to read, you know, as part of the kind of history of the genre. So I would highly recommend reading anthologies in general. I want to read more this year, but this one is a great one if you can do it. It's like, it's 1,000 pages long, and like all of the stories look like this, shoving as many words as possible on to its massive pages. So I mean, it's definitely a journey, but I do recommend doing something like this. If you can read a story a day, that is fantastic, but I do find that if I set myself a goal like that, I just cannot do it because life is too busy, and you know, the baby starts teething, and it's like, oh, I'm not reading a story a day, because then I just won't even read anything else ever. So I definitely found it most useful to just read it like back to back to back. But I do think if you can swing reading a story a day or something like that, it is a great thing to do. Now onto the category of kind of the challenging is what I've called it. Some of these more so than others. By the way, I would put all my other rereads basically in that best of the best category. All my rereads were fantastic. I'll put them at the end of the video though, because many of them I've talked to you a lot about before. Pretty much all of them deserve to be in the best of the best category. Moving on to The Seven Moods of Maria Almeida. This won the Booker Prize this year, obviously, and deservedly so, I think. So really, I didn't read all the long list or even all the short list, but when I read this, I really did enjoy it, and I think it was a worthy winner. It's about Maria Almeida, who was a photographer. He photographed kind of all sides of the Sri Lankan Civil War and said that he kind of had no loyalties. So it's actually very interesting to kind of read this book after Passage North. They are completely different stylistically, but I appreciated reading them both actually, because they're kind of about the Sri Lankan Civil War, and they both follow young men. So basically he finds himself in this kind of hallucinogenic, kaleidoscopic, all those kind of words, afterlife, and he can sort of, he's kind of overlaid over Colombo, so he can sort of see and maybe influence events after his death. He basically tries to solve his own murder and also uncover some of his most damning photographs and some of the worst injustices of the Sri Lankan Civil War from the afterlife. And the first 100 pages or so of this are very kind of disorientating, but if you can make your way through them, and they are still good, but if you can make your way through them, the plot kind of picks up. And I really liked it. I really liked the ending. I just thought it was extremely well written. It did put me in mind of Marlon James, so if you like his work then you might like this one as well. The Deloriad, which was one of the debuts I read this year, wasn't always super enjoyable to read because it is a challenging book, but it is such an impressive debut. It's by Missouri Williams. One of the more unique novels, I would say, on this list. Again, very kind of distinctive stylistically. But it's about, so some unknown apocalyptic event has happened and we are focusing on this family who may or may not be the last humans on Earth. And the matriarch of this family wants to repopulate the Earth in her image, which encourages a little bit of incest. Yes, gross. It's got a kind of like Greek tragedy feel to it in terms of that kind of plot. And also people describe it as gothic as well. It's definitely dripping in atmosphere. But yeah, whether it's the incest or some sort of like chemical problem with the new environment or just living in a new environment where there's no other human beings, her children begin to become unrecognisable to her, like new forms of a human. And also maybe us, the reader, as well. I mean, this is amazingly written. The style is very thick and cloying. It feels kind of impenetrable sometimes. I can't wait to see what she writes next. Next up, we've got David Musgrave's Lambda, which was also a debut novel that I read this year. Also very impressive. It's set in an alternative sort of near future Britain. Musgrave imagines lots of, you know, technologies and things that might happen in our future. So there's like a server state who's just hacking governments around the world and generally causing chaos and just doing things for their own ends. There's sentient objects which supposedly make life easier for the owner, but of course have a whole host of ethical issues. And there's some very funny scenes involving a conversational toothbrush. There's all sorts going on in here. And then the kind of main plot line is, so it's an alternative future Britain because there's also these lambdas. So they are an aquatic people who resemble the human newborn, who kind of wash up from some breeding ground in the north somewhere onto British shores, and they're sort of begrudgingly included in society in second-rate jobs and accommodation. And then the army of Lambda Ascension apparently claims responsibility for a bombing at a school, which obviously ramps some tensions up. And then we mainly follow one protagonist. She's involved with the Lambdas because she's working on the police force. Most of her story is told in this auto-narration style, which is very prescient because of all the kind of AI stuff about writing and art at the end of last year, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it this year. So it's kind of clunky and like as if it was narrated by a computer essentially. And then there's other stuff going on which I won't go into, but there is so much packed in here. It's very cleverly done. I loved some of the themes, especially how Musgrave is using the kind of lambdas, the humans and the machines, all to show different forms of kind of like how we think of ourselves. So yeah, like I say, the style is quite odd and kind of clunky. The plot line doesn't flow, but I think it's all intentional. But if that sounds like your kind of thing, then I think you'll really enjoy it, and I'm really interested to see what Musgrave produces next. I've got Angels in this category because it is emotionally challenging, this one. This is the only book on this list which I almost put down. As I've said, I have got much better at putting books down this year, and I almost put this one down because I was just like, this is so dreary and depressing and painful, and is it even gonna get any different from this? Because it's about Jamie and Bill, who are two born losers, and they just go around the States going in and out of bars, getting into trouble. The prose is gorgeous and very kind of searing, but I just thought, is it going to be like this for the whole book? But the plot does pick up, and it has one of the most heartrending endings I've read for a long time. Big trigger warning on this one for literally everything, I think. Please be aware, it is super dark. But yeah, I found it deeply affecting by the end, and it sort of asks questions about, you know, redemption, basically. So I would recommend, but be warned. This one didn't really fit into any of my other categories. It sort of fits into this one, so I'm putting it in here. It's Hilary Mantel's The Giant O'Brien. As I said, it kind of does fit in this category because I do think you have to focus on this one. You have to give it some love and some time, even though it's a short little novel. It's best to read it in a few sittings, enjoy it that way, because I think that's how you get the best out of Mantel's prose and what she's doing with this book. It's about Charles O'Brien, who was an Irish giant, an unusually tall man. He leaves Ireland, goes to London to kind of seek his fortune and let people view him for money, essentially. He became a bit of a sensation. And then at the same time, there's this renowned surgeon called John Hunter who collects specimens, and he's after Charles O'Brien's skeleton, against the wishes of O'Brien. But yes, Mantel weaves a very beautiful, again very dark, so again be warned, very beautiful kind of story out of this. Would I say it was beautiful? It's quite dark. It's more just like very whole, this book. Like it really feels perfectly balanced, like all the themes, you know, O'Brien versus Hunter, it's just perfectly balanced, perfectly pitched. Mantel just obviously delighted in language, and you can really see that in this one, and I highly recommend it. So now we're into the kind of straight up enjoyable, so from the challenging to the more kind of readable end of things, but they are no less kind of clever and interesting and insightful for that. So we've got 3 books, but I only have one actual copy, which is The Ends by James Smith. This was a very considered, intelligent, enjoyable read. Just again, nicely balanced, nicely pitched, nicely paced, and just very satisfying to read, I think. It's quite hard to find books that are actually just satisfying to read. It's actually the final novel in a quartet of books. I would like to go back and read the other 3, but this one can be read as a standalone very easily. It's about a world which has been swallowed by the anomaly. I'm using air quotes a lot today, so I apologise for that. The anomaly is some sort of space-time event. So when you're inside the anomaly, you can't die. You're just going to get looped back to where you were physically and mentally when you were first enveloped by the anomaly. So you're going to lose all memory of the kind of life you lived between first being enveloped and when you died. Sort of like video game death. And this concept really produces a lot of interesting questions, I think, about life and death, because you'd think in a deathless world everyone would be more throwaway about their lives, but suddenly they become very invested in not dying, even more so maybe than before, some might say, because you lose that intervening period, but maybe the people around you haven't. It opens up just so many interesting questions, I think. I think Smith does a fantastic job of kind of thoroughly looking at all the implications of a concept like this. And it's not too long. It's not like he does it over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. At the same time, he presents us with a really interesting, you know, propulsive plot. So we particularly follow Theo. He has got this virus, which means he should have died ages ago. So he should have looped inside the anomaly, you know, lots of times, but he's never looped. So he's quite invested in his life, obviously, and he wants to go and confront his wife who left him. She's in London, he's in LA. There's not much infrastructure anymore, so he has to trek across America. That journeying aspect always makes for a good novel, I think, as well. And here it's in good hands. You know, we get to see a lot of different things as the reader. And in general, I just found it to be really enjoyable and I highly recommend. So that is The Ends. We've got Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I've seen it on a lot of Best of 2022 lists. Lots of people love this book. I really liked it. I found it so enjoyable. I couldn't really stop reading it. It's about 2 friends who develop games together and make games together. And it's a love letter to gaming. I find it so interesting, the kind of process. I'd never really thought about the process of designing, making a game and kind of what an art it is to make a good game. It's got a well-paced story there, you know, you're following these friends as they go through their lives and grow up together. And at the same time, it's got that kind of interesting stuff. So the stuff that I don't know much about and I find really interesting to read about. And then on top of that, Seven does a really nice job of just depicting life through the video game metaphor, and contrasting real life with games and why games are so important and like play. And so she does some really nice stuff with that, I think. Written in such a way that you really feel the characters and you feel their warmth for one another. It's just a real triumph of a book, I think, this one, and I can see why so many people like it. So I highly recommend that one too, especially if you're kind of in a reading slump or something, you just want something to draw you in like that. This is the book. Finally, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. So this is a little novella about a father of 4 daughters living in 1980s Ireland, and he delivers coal for a living, certainly, and he makes an unsavoury discovery at the convent when he is delivering coal one morning. It's about the Magdalen laundries of Ireland at the time, and how horrific they were, basically. And at the same time, it's about kind of small things like these, as the title would suggest. The small things that make up a life, and also kind of everyday small acts of goodwill and what they can do and how much impact they can have in the world. And she does all this very beautifully in a very small number of pages. The writing is kind of just very evocative and atmospheric, and I really, really enjoyed it. I would highly recommend. It is set at Christmas time, so I don't know if you want to read it, whether you want to wait till Christmas time again, because it just captures that time of year really nicely as well. On to the classics now. We've got 2. First up, The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin. It's the only Le Guin I read this year, maybe. So it's about George Orr, who discovers that his dreams can change and shape reality. He, unfortunately, kind of against his will, comes under the influence of a psychiatrist who, by sort of hypnotism, starts to use Orr's dreams for his own purposes and what he thinks is for the good of the world, but obviously has often dire implications, mostly because he's not good at wording things, which really spoke to me because I hate imprecise wording. This is an incredible book for when it was published. There's so much in here, there's so many ideas in here. By modern standards, there's probably a couple things where you might say it's a little bit naive, but in general, it's a really fantastic book. It is less warm, I would say, than some of Le Guin's other writing, because it just kind of feels like dreamlike and almost like a thought experiment rather than inviting you very deeply into the internal worlds of its characters. It's really a novel of ideas, but it is fantastic. My other classic would be Volume 2 of In Search of Lost Time, which, no, not Volume 2. Oh my gosh, let me put this back. I hate Volume 2. It is, in fact, Volume 3, The Gamanta's Way of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, that I really enjoyed. Just spoke to me, this one, especially compared to some of the others. I read it in the gloomy days of January last year, and I just got it. Caught the Proust bug for a minute there. Sadly, it didn't continue, but I liked it because I just thought it was well balanced. There was less random stuff. There was definitely less of the stuff I really don't enjoy, which is obsession with a young girl or homophobia, internalized homophobia. Just less of that. I enjoyed his kind of, the narrator's in with society and all these kind of characters that he now brings to life. Just generally, it totally worked for me. As I say, sadly, it didn't continue. So the follow-ups. I read 2 highly anticipated books for me this year, Either Or by Elif Batuman and Moonwitch Spider King by Marlon James. So this one, this was really a pleasant surprise. It was a much kind of tauter, more just directly enjoyable read than Black Leopard Red Wolf. And it fleshes out the story in a really satisfying way. It's narrated by Sogalon, who is the Moon Witch, and she tells her own backstory, her own life story, which is very interesting. I think it was a real kind of page turner and very pacey. And then she tells how she got involved and kind of expands on the major plot line, which is this group of characters looking for this boy, which was kind of talked about obviously in the first book as well, but it's just less chaotic and more linear, this one, and I think it really works. I liked the glimpses we got of James's world, his kind of descriptions. I'm really looking forward to the third installment now. Also, Either Or, again, really I didn't expect to get a sequel to The Idiot, but now it makes total sense. Batuman really builds on what she did in the first book. I can kind of see the scope of what she's trying to do in these books. She's kind of commenting on novel writing as she writes them. Very literary, like I said, Celine, the protagonist, she's in her second year at Harvard and she's just reflecting on everything, including she pulls in all the books she's reading at the time, includes them in her narrative of what's going on in her life. Didn't love the first part of this just because it didn't appeal to me, but it was nonetheless very realistic, because she's got this kind of Ivan obsession going on, who is kind of an unrequited love of hers. One of my rereads, which is the next category, was The Idiot, because I listened to that before I read this just so I could refamiliarise myself with it, and I'm really glad I did actually. But you can definitely see a little bit of maturation here from Celine. She is a little bit older, a little bit wiser, a tiny bit, and there are very subtle differences between the two books. But in general, if you enjoyed The Idiot, I think you'll enjoy this one too. I do love her funny observations. Yeah, again, I really look forward to the final book in this. I assume there's going to be another book. Okay, so we've talked about The Idiot briefly, which was fantastic. And then my other rereads. So, as you can see, I reread quite a few books this year. Piranesi I listened to. I think Chiwetel Ejiofor did a great job of reading this book. Just warm, touching, wonderful, magical, just like the first time round. I want everyone to read this book. The first few pages when you open it just look like, what on earth is happening? But I promise it does get pretty readable pretty quickly, and I highly, highly recommend it. Best to know almost nothing about that one because it just reveals itself so beautifully. Then I reread Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Djachenko. Just fantastic. One of the cleverest novels maybe that I've ever read, just in terms of its sheer ambition and innovation in terms of like the speculative fiction genre. I listened to this one the first time round, so I was really happy to read it this time, and also I had the backing of book club to help me delve into some of its mysteries a little bit more, because it is packed with mysteries. Yeah, it's just quite difficult to describe this one, I think, but it follows Sasha, a young woman. She's on holiday with her mum when this strange man, who seems to be able to manipulate time and reality, tells her to do these very odd tasks. And then when she's done those tasks, she throws up coins, kind of these ancient looking coins. He essentially ends up instructing her to go to this college or this special institute of technology, something like that. Institute of Special Technologies, goes there and she doesn't know what she's learning, she doesn't get it, and all sort of is revealed over the course of the book. It is a tough, challenging one to get to grips with, but it is so wonderful, and the sequel is coming out this spring and I cannot wait, because I think it's going to have to answer some of the questions that we had left over from this one. But the back says it's a blend of adventure, magic, science and philosophy. Then we have The Sellout by Paul Beattie. When I first read this, I think a lot of it went over my head, but I do remember being very impressed by it. This time round I was better prepared for it and I really enjoyed it again. I think it is just a masterwork. I think Beattie is just an incredible writer. Again, very distinctive stylistically. This one is quite challenging as well. I do think having a knowledge of Black American history, having a knowledge of the American judicial system, that sort of thing, is helpful before you go into this one. Beattie just tackles issues of race in America in a very interesting, dynamic, and effective way in this book, where the narrator sort of accidentally, sort of on purpose, ends up reinstating slavery and segregation in his small community in LA. He is a black man, so this causes all sorts of levels of problems for him. He unsurprisingly ends up in the Supreme Court about it. So yes, highly recommend this one. Hoping to read more Beatty this year. I just think he's an incredible author. Finally, final book is 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. Happy to report that I enjoyed this one again this year. It is a psychologically realistic take on King Lear, set on a farm in Iowa. This farmer decides to split his farm between his 3 daughters, and one of them kind of demurs and doesn't immediately take him up on this, and this leads to her being disinherited, and all sorts of chaos, unravelling, and secrets coming to the surface happens as a result. Again, trigger warning on this one. I'll put it on my blog post. Yes, this is a dark book, please be warned. Yeah, you sort of end up being taken in at the beginning, everything seems sort of normal, and then all of these kind of secrets begin to emerge, and it is fantastically done. And I read it with King Lear, which was just so enjoyable. I loved seeing the way that the 2 texts talk to each other. So yeah, I would recommend this one again, and I look forward to reading more Smiley this year as well, I think. So my loves, that is everything. I do have a few honourable mentions. I was quite harsh this year because I just read so many good books. Even those books that I'm not mentioning at all, a lot of them were kind of worthy in some way, or taught me something about my reading, or just, you know, I enjoyed reading a lot of them as well. So I have been pretty picky this year, but these are my honourable mentions. White Noise by Don DeLillo, Appliance by J.O. Morgan, Booth by Karen Joy Fowler, The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich, Persuasion by Jane Austen, and Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. There'll be links to all my original reviews as well on my blog post if you're interested. But that is all from me. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.